Today I am going to deal with one aspect of economic history of the Jews. The title of the lecture is Jews in Medieval Economy, Victims of Ambivalence, and I hope by the end of the lecture the title will be clarified to all of you. First of all, I think we have to start with two questions. The first question, can one talk about Jewish economic history? Is there an economic history of the Jews? Or are we talking about the history of the Jews in any particular country or region where their history is, or their economic history is part of the economy of the country? What kind of connection can there be in the economic life of the Jews in Germany, an economic life of the Jews in Turkey, or Tunisia, or Egypt, or Poland? Should we not then speak of the economic life of the Jews in any given country or region? Now, this is the first question. And in answer to this question, I think we have to bear in mind two points. First, that despite the differences in the economy of the regions where the Jews lived, the Jews in the Middle Ages throughout the world had some common features. They had some common ordinances, laws, traditions, attitudes that made them share the same kind of economic life to a certain extent. There were several economic regulations that date back to antiquity or Talmudic times that were relevant to the Jews in the East or in the West. And the Jews in Babylon, or the Jews in Spain, the Jews in Germany, the Jews in France, they shared that common tradition of attitudes to economic life. So this is the first thing, and there are, if we have time, I can give you several examples of such common economic attitudes that Jews shared from antiquity, and therefore there is definitely something in common as far as economic life is concerned. But the other answer, or a second answer, is really entirely dependent on the attitudes of the external factors, of the authorities, because it is the common features, characteristics of the policy that was pursued by rulers, both Muslim and Christian, that made the economic life of the Jews in various lands share certain common features. So the fact that rulers of all countries, whether Muslim or Christian, pursued a certain policy which is the same towards the Jews, made the economic life of the Jews follow some similar, if not identical, path. For example, just to give you a point to clarify the matter, the fact, for example, that certain professions were closed to the Jews in practically everywhere in the world, that makes us understand better why in certain fields there were no Jews. The fact that there were also some changes in Jewish life that came as a result of a policy of the king made the Jews also take a certain attitude as far as the economy was concerned. For example, the fact that there were constant expulsions from time to time in various parts of the world made Jews realize that it was probably more worth their while not to invest money in certain fields, for example, not to buy property, because you cannot put a field or a house on your shoulders and go from one land to another. Right? Now, these are certain Therefore, the two major points that have to be borne in mind when we speak of an economic history of the Jews, despite the diversity, despite the differences, therefore, in the background, in the financial and economic backgrounds in the Jews in various lands, the fact that they shared some common traditions going back to Talmudic or Mishnaic times, to antiquity, that made their attitude to economy very specific, and no less important, the fact that the Jews were treated in a certain manner by the authorities, whether in the Muslim and Christian world, made the Jews follow a certain pattern in economic life that enable us to speak of the economic history of the Jews in the Middle Ages in general. Now, the second question that I thought I would raise here and try to answer it is whether the Jews have any special economic characteristic in their genes, religious, cultural, or ethnic background. And here I come to the famous theory or thesis that was raised by various economic historians, but first and foremost by a German historian of economy, Zombart. Now, Zombart was a well-known historian of economy, and he wrote a book in German, which has been translated into English, and the title of the book in English is Jews and Modern Capitalism. Well, this is a most interesting book, but it must be read with a proper guide, because the book suggests that the Jews, by the very nature of their religion, of their faith, of their religious and cultural background, they are born to be businessmen. That there is something in their religion that makes them love money. Now, this is a very serious economic historian. He is not just an anti-Semite. He says, look how things are in Jewish religion. Before Yom Kippur, the Jew is asked actually to make an account of his life, the good and the bad deeds. And he is actually praying to his God to open the Sefer, the book of life, and to see how many good deeds and how many bad actions he did. Everything, he said, a calculation. And in the end, of course, there is a result, whether he's better or worse than he should be, and accordingly he is rewarded or punished, or he seeks God's pardon accordingly. Everything is recorded. Everything is, so to speak, calculated. This is the training of the Jews in their heart and in their mind. And of course, he says, look at the history of the Jews. Wherever they are and wherever they've been in the past, you can immediately see and show how interested they are in business, in trade, in money, and everything. And this is because of their religion. This is because of their faith. This is because of their genes. That's how they are born. Jews can't help it. Of course, this is all a lot of rubbish, and I would like to refer to this. Not because I need to apologize, because if really the Jews are, or have been, the primary force behind capitalism, I would say I can be proud, because this seems to be the only system so far that has succeeded in doing anything. And other systems have collapsed and brought hunger, and despite all the inequality and the and the bad points that the system has. But I am interested in the truth, in the historical truth. How can one, a man like Zombart, who is held to be a great expert in economic history, suggest that the Jewish religion is based on a capitalistic attitude, when the whole Torah, if you analyze it, is far, far from being capitalistic? What kind of capitalism is that, that says you till the ground for 6 years, and on the 7th year you do nothing? Is that an attitude that would be encouraged in any capitalistic society? What kind of a religion is this? What kind of a capitalistic religion is this, when it says you can have a Hebrew slave for 6 years, and the 7th year you have to release him? What kind of a capitalistic religion is this, where it says all lands, all property that has been sold in the course of time, comes the Jubilee year and it has to be returned to its original owners, so that poverty is never perpetuated. If I lose my property because of mismanagement, I am assured that my children at least will have it returned to them. On the contrary, I can go on and on showing that the Torah's attitude is not only far from being capitalistic, it seems probably the nearest to the socialist order that has recently collapsed. But historically speaking, let us forget, of course I can also quote something of extreme importance. What kind of a capitalistic religion is that religion that says, if people owe you money, and comes the sabbatical year, the money, the debt is cancelled? What kind of a capitalistic world is this that Judaism envisages? Now, all this, of course, shows that there is nothing serious in Zombart's thesis. It's all really a prejudiced opinion of a man who might have been a great expert, but he was at the same time a great fool because of some of his prejudices. There is another aspect that Zombart either did not want to know or did not know, and that is life of the Jews in their homeland. You know, when you analyze the history of the Jews in Israel before the destruction of the temple, look in the shore of the coast. You will not find one single Jewish city. They did not build one single city. What kind of a capitalistic people are the Jews if they have not thought even of building one port? The only port that existed, Jaffa, was not built by the Israelites. And there is nothing else. All the Jews at the time, the Israelites, were concentrated in a mountainous area, in the least likely to be the prominent place for capitalistic endeavor. For capitalism, you need first and foremost cities which can serve as ports for import and export and navigation. The great King Solomon, when he finally decided to have his own navy, whose help did he need to do that? For those of you who know their Bible will remember that he needed the help of the king of the Phoenicians of the north in order to build the navy. The Jews were not even able to build their own navy. And that is considered a turning point in Israelite history. Now, all these things indicate that the Jews, as long as they lived in their historical homeland, they never developed anything that can be considered the capitalistic order. We can do away, therefore, with such thesis that has no historical basis whatsoever. Now, is it not true, however, that the Jews have developed a certain ability in dealing with finance, commerce, etc.? Yes. But this is not because of their religion, not because of their genes, not because of the blood they have in their veins, but because of other historical circumstances that they did not choose, but were imposed on them. The economic consequences of a life in the exile, The consequences of an exile where the Jews were scattered in so many lands, in so many communities, where the involuntary basis, foundations for a certain economic life that certainly led to a capitalistic trade and finance and so on. But that was not the Jews' choice, that they were the victims of the circumstances. They never chose to be exiled from their land. They were pushed out of their land. We can understand how it came about that the Jews became such great international businessmen. Why they enjoyed such a status in international trade. Why? Because of the possible relations they could have and could develop throughout the world at the time. A Jew who was in Bukhara in Central Asia could send a note to a Jew in Isfahan in Persia, who can send a note to another city in Byzantine, and so on and so forth. This exile of the Jews, all the communities in the Middle Ages that were spread in so many regions of the world at the time, enabled the Jews to develop a certain affinity and expertise, ability in international trade that other nations did not have. One of the examples, the most famous examples, is the international Jewish merchants who are called the Radhanites. We do not know the origin of the word, and therefore I am not going to bring you all the theories that have been suggested by various historians. We don't know the etymology of the word, the origin of the word, but the Radhanites were known to be Jews engaged in international trade between the East and the West. Their trade began in eastern provinces like Persia, Iran, and extended to the west in France and Germany. In a certain period, in the Middle Ages, they were the first and foremost businessmen in international trade. But we do understand why it came about, or how it came about, that the Jews were able to play such an important role in international trade because of their connections with other Jews, because of a language that they could use, the Hebrew language, and they can send to any community and people understood. And Jews in other communities were actually served as agents, so that there is a complete network there, naturally created as far as their business was concerned. It was not intended, designed for this purpose, but it served this purpose as well. Despite all this, there are certainly very big differences between the economic life of the Jews in Muslim lands and the Jews in Christian lands. In general, one can say that under Islam, the Jews enjoyed a much greater diversity in their economic endeavor, enterprises and professions. There were far less restrictions imposed by the Muslims on the Jews in their trade, in professions, in crafts, and so on. And that's how we find in some parts of the Muslim world even people engaged in farming until the 20th century. In Morocco, for example, in the Yemen, we find also very expert craftsmen and silversmith and goldsmith in various parts of the Muslim world. Jews were engaged in that, on top, of course, of finance and business and so on. In the Christian world, it was far more restricted, and we'll see why. Even though the Jews were allowed in some places to engage in farming, they chose often not to do so, for a very simple reason. A farmer, a Jewish farmer who might be expelled at any time, as I said earlier, could not have put on his shoulders his field and go to somewhere else. But if he has money, that there is a possibility that he could do so. Not always, but There is a possibility. Now in Christian Europe, when we analyze the situation in Christian Europe, there were differences between the north and the south. By north I mean England, France, Germany, Austria. The south is Spain, Provence, Italy. In the south, since the Jews had lived there in Roman times and there were no restrictions in the economic life whatsoever, we find more and more Jews in this part of Christian Europe who were engaged in a variety of professions. First of all, they had property. We don't know whether they were engaged in farming, but certainly they had orchards and fields and gardens. Probably there were non-Jewish farmers who were engaged by them, who were employed by them, but nevertheless they had. It has been, for example, calculated that in the 13th century, Jews in Barcelona owned about 2/3 of all the property around the city. But that is not always the case. It's not the natural, normal case. Usually Jews slowly learned their lesson and began to invest less and less in property. But in this part of Southern Europe, we find a variety of professions in which the Jews were engaged. Not every Jew was a businessman, was a merchant. Not every Jew was a money lender. I have shown in various works that I have written how, based on documents from archives, that there were in fact many Jews employed in a variety of professions. There were craftsmen, there were shoemakers, there were tanners, there were tailors, there were silversmiths, jewelers, everything. They were all, and of course there were physicians, and there were professional men, teachers and scientists in this part of the world, in the Mediterranean, say, Christian lands. Because of the Roman tradition, under Rome, they had lived like this, they were able, and therefore feudalism that developed in Europe still did not throw out the Jews from various professions and crafts in which they were engaged. In the north it was totally different. And here I would like, when I say that the Jews were victims of an ambivalent policy or of ambivalence, I mean the following. How did the Jews come to settle in the northern part of Christian Europe? It is not a mystery. We can check exactly how the Jews first settled in France, in Germany, in England, and other parts of Christian Europe. You know how? They were invited by the rulers to come. Charlemagne and his descendants, the Carolingians, we have privileges, letters that were given to the Jews who settled. Which types of Jews did the princes and kings of Europe want to settle in their land? Did they need craftsmen? Of course not. They had plenty of them. Did they need farmers? They did not. They had plenty of them. Did they need soldiers? No. What they needed, first and foremost, merchants with international connections. In many of the early documents written in Latin of the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, two words are often interchanged. And the two words are the following. Mercator and Judeus. Mercator is a merchant, and Judeus is a Jew. For Christians in France, in England, in Germany at the time, the word Jew was synonymous with merchant. For these people, the Jews were first and foremost merchants. So the Jews, all the privileges we have from the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, They speak of settlement of Jews in various cities, in various regions of Europe, for one specific reason, that they should act as international merchants. That's what they needed, the kings, and that's what they wanted. They wouldn't bring just poor Jews to settle there. What do they need them for? They wouldn't bring craftsmen, they had plenty of them, and farmers and everything. But they needed international merchants. Merchants with good international connections, people with money. People with money. It was not on humanitarian reasons that Jews were allowed to come and settle in European countries. And Jews who came and settled were not fugitives from other countries. They came from Spain, from Provence, from Italy, from Egypt, with money, with connections, with family behind. They came and settled. This is the beginning of the small communities in Ashkenazi countries. These are the people who settled there. Now, how do they come? Only merchants? Of course not. A wealthy Jew who comes, he may come with his brother, with his children, but he also came with other Jews that not as wealthy as he was, with domestic help, with some people who helped him, sometimes with a shochet, sometimes with a teacher who depended on him. So he came with that kind of an entourage, people around him. And this is the nucleus of a small community that would rise in Europe at the time. Now the trouble is that Christian Europe forgot very quickly who invited the Jews and what the purpose of the invitation was. The Jews did not come and impose themselves. They could not have. It was not just an open country where you can come and settle. It is interesting that in all the privileges we have, there is a very clear language used. We are allowing you, we are inviting you to settle in this land, and we allow you to engage in international trade, in commerce, and settle wherever you like, and have and live in accordance with your law, and have a synagogue, and have Christian maids as well, things that were forbidden by Christian doctrine. Rudiger of Speyer in the Rhineland, he's a churchman who was the head of the city of Speyer. And in a privilege that he sent to the Jews in 1084, he says, "Because I want to add 1,000-fold to the wealth of the city, I allow you Jews to come and settle in Speyer, and I will permit you to do this and this and that." He did not even hide the purpose. It was prosperity of the city that he wanted, and therefore he asked the Jews to come, because it was the Jews, he believed, who were going to contribute to the prosperity, because Christians at that time were unable to engage in international trade. You need connections, you need people whom you can trust and who will trust you, who will accept orders, who will accept credit. And so when a Jew wrote in Hebrew, the first checks were written by Jews. When a Jew wrote, "I promise to pay you so much money, upon receipt of the goods," a Jew in Alexandria accepted this and sent the goods. No Christian would have been actually in this situation at the time. We shall see, of course, when the day comes and a new bourgeoisie would arise, a middle class would arise, they would not need the Jews. They would throw them out of international trade. Because the Jew has done his work, now it's over, now we have other people to do it. But until such a time, the Jews were needed. It is not therefore such an impossible thing to understand that Jews who were brought because of their wealth and international trade connections, that they would be also the first people to give credit. Today we know what it means, that credit should be available. Can you imagine any part of the world that is advanced, which does not have possibilities of credit? Even the the most prosperous firms must be able to have credit because they have a lot of investments and they do not have the assets available. This is one of the conditions, not only of big business, it's also one of the conditions of a daily life. You rely on this. In those days, there were no banks. In those days, there were not people with cash, because even the wealthy people of Christian society invested their money in property. Feudal Europe was based on the land ownership. And now, very often people think that if the Jew is the creditor, lends money, he is the rich, and the Christian, of course, who borrows the money is the poor. Oh no, no. I have discovered in my research that very often the Jew who gives the credit is less rich than the Christian who receives the credit. How come? Because I have made the charts. I have examined which months of the year, for example, the Jewish creditors, money lenders lend money. Which months of the year Christian borrowed money. It's very clear. When we speak of credit, suddenly you will find that Christians borrowed a lot of money from Jews in a certain month. And then comes a certain month in June, July, nothing, zero. They don't borrow money. This is not 1 year which is a coincidence. Year after year after year. It is very clear. Before the harvest, you borrow money. You've invested your money in the fields, in the farming. After the harvest, you have the money you don't need. You pay back and you have plenty of money. It's very simple. I am not suggesting that there were not poor people who needed credit, but there were also poor Jews who needed credit. Now, when the Jews stopped being the big international merchants, they were still needed by the rulers of Europe. They were needed for two reasons, and these are contradictory reasons. First and foremost, they were needed because of the taxes and subsidies they were able to provide the king. They were able to pay taxes and they were taxable. The Jews were taxpayers. In Christian society, the number of people who were exempt from taxation was large. And those who were not exempt had no money to pay them, the serfs. The upper classes, many of them were exempt. The clergy were exempt. So the king needed cash and needed taxes, and the Jews were excellent candidates for that. The Jews could be taxed, and they would complain very little. They were docile, and they knew that their existence in the place dependent on the amount of money they would be able to give the king by way of taxation or subsidies. And this is what they did. And that's how by the 13th century the kings of Europe called the Jews our treasure. Like the Castilian king, they said tesoro nuestro, our treasure. In Latin, servi camera, the slaves of the king, they belong to us, our property. The Jews was the property of the king. That's how the king saw the Jews. And therefore they were an asset because of the money they could provide, cash for taxes and subsidies and so on and so forth. But the other field in which the Jews were vitally needed, but for which they were also intensively hated, was money lending. Usury. And this is, of course, it crops up again and again in various historical studies and in various sources. What is happening? Why did the Jews become such money lenders? Now, of course, in some parts of the world, there were not all money lenders. 5%, 10% of the Jews. But in some parts of the world, there were many. In a community in France or in Germany in the Middle Ages, you find a large proportion of Jews who served as money lenders. But can we imagine any Jew in the Middle Ages who was in a position to impose credit who could decide how much interest he would like to get from a Christian borrower? Can you imagine really that the sources that speak all the time against Jewish money lenders, and you know there are plenty, always, even in places where there were no Jews. Shakespeare's England. There were no Jews in England now, ever from 1290. Still, in Shakespeare's plays we see the Jew, a moneylender, a usurer, he profits, he sucks the blood of the Christian. This is the idea that became predominant in parts of Europe where there were not even Jews. How did this come about? Is it possible really to imagine that the Jews imposed their own economic tradition, structure on Christian Europe, where there is such a powerful minority? Did they have an army behind them to support such an imposition? Of course, this is all absolute nonsense. The Jews gave credit to Christians as long as those who could stop Jewish credit wanted this to continue. The kings, primarily the kings of Europe, were interested in the Jews giving credit to the Christians. Why? A variety of reasons. First, there was no possibility for life, for economic life, to continue without credit. And how convenient it was for this not very nice work to be done by the villain Jews. It was convenient for the Jews to perform this kind of work. Especially that Christians, just as Jews, are not allowed to lend money with interest to fellow Jews. Christians also are not allowed. It doesn't mean that this did not happen. A lot of things people are not allowed to do and they break the law. And I ask you, who? Were they creditors? Were there money lenders in places where there were no Jews? Of course there were. The Italians, the Lombards, everywhere, wherever the Jews left, creditors, Christian creditors, took their place. So, first, the Jews were needed as money lenders to perform an economic, vital task. And it was convenient for them to do it because the Jews, in fact, were not Christians and were permitted by law. And what does it matter? People hate their creditors anyway. And it's good that it's the Jews. But there is another reason. If the Jews held cash, they did not invest in property because of expulsions and persecution. They had the cash, so it's convenient. They had the money. What will they do with the money otherwise? We're talking about the rich Jews, of course. And so that was actually reality. The Jews had the cash that they could actually operate this money by giving credit to people. Third, it was in the interest of the king that this Jewish money prosper and increase. Why? Because the more money the Jew had, the more money the king had. The more money the Jew had is in his coffers, the more money the king could actually ask by way of taxation and subsidies. It's obvious. If you don't have money, if you don't have cash, what kind of tax can I impose? We're not going to send you to the army. So what can we do? Therefore, it is necessary for the king to allow the Jews to make their money work increase in order that he should get this money, or part of it, or most of it, as tax. And the last reason that is often ignored or not known by people. The king found it extremely convenient that the Jews should get interest from Christians. It was in his interest. Why? Because this is the only way the only way the king could get Christian money to his treasury. He could not tax the clergy. He could not tax many people in the Christian society. So, allow the Jews to give money as credit, let them get interest from the Christians, and I will get it. So, in fact, the money moved from Christian pockets to Jewish pockets, and from the Jews' pockets to the king's coffers. It was his interest, pure and simple. Of course, if somebody would like to incite people against the Jews and to show how the Jews were terrible, you can always ignore all these facts and present the Jews as the terrible devils of the Christian world. If the Christian rulers of Europe did not want the Jews to give credit, can anyone really think seriously that the Jews could have done it by force? And then what about the interest, the very, very high interest? This is another myth. Who decided how much interest a Jew should get? The Jew, you think? The Jew decided in Castile that 33%, in Aragon 20%, in another place 45%? Invariably it was the king who decided. The king decided how much interest the Jews should get. In 1215, there was a church council, the Lateran Council, the Fourth Lateran Council that met. And there, one of the decisions that was decided by the church was about Jewish interest, usually. It is interesting if you read the text, to whom actually the text was addressed. It doesn't say we forbid you Jews to take, usually we forbid you to take too much interest from the Christian. It says we forbid the kings and princes of the Christian countries to allow the Jews to take more interest than what is actually reasonable. The Lateran Council knew that it was not the Jews who decided to take so much interest. It was, of course, the king, the princes of Europe. The Jews were indeed victims of an ambivalence. They were the victims of a certain reality that they did not create. They were the victims of a certain economic policy that they did not necessarily want. But it was created, and they were in it. They had no choice, because that's why they were allowed to enter. And of course, when we have the Christian anti-Semitic propaganda that says Jews are all money lenders. Now, there may be right statistically that the number of Jews who lend money were many in various parts of Europe. But let me remind you what we said earlier. The Jews did not come to Europe as farmers and craftsmen. The Jews came to Europe as merchants and people with money. Okay, what do you expect such Jews to do? A generation later, their children should become now suddenly what? Professional soldiers? It was only natural that they continued in what their parents trained them, and in the only thing that they could succeed, because they had money. Myth and reality, they have to be clearly distinguished in history. When one assumes certain things, he has to check. Just as Zombardi can be a very serious historian of economy and make such statements that have no foundation whatsoever. For these such works by Zombart and supposedly scientific works that were produced in Europe were the basis of the most violent anti-Semitic movements, including the Nazi period. I think I can prove without any shadow of doubt where the Jews where wanted, they carried on. Where they did not want, they could not carry on. When the King of England decided, we've got enough, we received enough from the Jews no longer have much more to offer, what did he do with them? Threw them out. Pure and simple. And very often we do not remember, we do not know, that before he threw them out, he went to the church and he asked compensation. He said, I want you to pay me so much money because I'm going to lose these Jews. How did Jews settle in northern Italy? They were in the south, in Sicily. They were in the Papal States and in Rome, a few. They were never in the north. They were never allowed in Venice. They were never allowed in Padua. They were not allowed in the northern cities of Italy. Now, from the 16th century onwards, we can trace, a bit earlier even, we can trace exactly why and how the Jews came to settle in Italy. There is the system that is called condotta. Condotta is a contract. The prince, the ruler, whatever, because Italy, of course, was not a united country, and there are plenty of princes, plenty of rulers there. The ruler invited a Jew to settle, and they signed a contract called condotta. If you read the condottas of the 16th, 17th century, you will be amazed what the king actually, what kind of conditions he set. I, so-and-so, allow you so-and-so with your family and people. We're talking about one family with several, just a minyan to conduct religious life almost. I allow you to come and settle here in the city, wherever it is, or in the village, on condition that you will give credit, you will lend money to the Christian population. That is the truth. Jews were allowed to settle in Italian cities on condition that they give credit. And then, of course, the church comes and says, you Jews, you suck the blood of the people, you're taking money from... But we came here because the king wanted us to give credit. Because somebody needed to give credit. In Italy, of course, they solved the problem. It was the church that initiated a certain type of banking, of benevolent banking, that gave credit free of charge. But that's only in Italy. But we know who is the greatest usurer next to the Jew and before the Jew. The Italians themselves. Who took the place of the Jewish creditors in England after 1290? The Lombards. Where the Christians did not want the competition of the Jews and the king agreed, the Jews could not do so. The best example is the Jews in international trade in the Mediterranean. I have checked the material, I have published the material in Barcelona. There were Jews engaged in international trade with Alexandria, with Beirut, with other cities in the Mediterranean. But of course they had the possibility to do so because they had Jews living in these parts of the world, sometimes even relatives. As long as there was no Christian who could do the job, everything was fine. So the Jew brought the goods, he imported the goods, he exported goods, etc. That's fine. When the Catalans in Barcelona learned the subject, they realized that there is plenty of money in international trade. And they understood the advantages of the Jews, that they had communities scattered all over the Mediterranean basin. They did the same. You know what they did? They organized, they set up colonies. And this was followed by the Italians. Have you ever heard of the colonies that were founded by the Venetians, by the Pisans, by the Firenze people, by all of these Italian and the Catalan merchants throughout the Mediterranean cities? There were colonies of Catalans, of Venetians and Genoese. If you haven't, check and see. They did exactly what they lacked. The Jews had the advantage of having Jewish communities in all these parts. They created the same type of things. And they threw out the Jews. And they blocked the way to Jewish international maritime trade. But they did not do so as far as credit was concerned, as long as they felt that the Jews could provide this, and they were not able to do so. When they were able to do so, the Jews were out of the business as well. Of course, the best proof, the best illustration, evidence that we have in order to show that the Jews are capable and were capable and could be engaged in any other is modern period. With the modern period, when restrictions were no longer imposed and the Jew was able to engage in various professions, you will see the number of people in the academic world, you will see people in the scientific world, you will see people in the professions, you see people, and in Israel the Jews proved also to be excellent farmers. The best farmers probably, but you don't need today more than 2% of the population as farmers, even that too much, with the mechanization. You simply don't need. In other words, I think it is time that we learn our history properly in order to understand that the Jews have been really the victims of a vicious ambivalence. That is to say, they were employed to play a certain role, vital role in the economic life of various countries, but they were also blamed for all the problems that this kind of financial enterprise caused to many people, because nobody, I'm sure, including you, would not like to be in debt to anyone and not to a bank. Well, thank you. If there are any questions, I am prepared. Yes, Rabbi Khan.
A credit system brings out or can bring out many disputes.
Yes.
If the Jews lent money to the Christians,
Right.
who protect them? Did the court?
If there are any problems between the creditor and the borrower, then of course they went to the Christian court. But of course, no Jew gave credit just like that. You give credit, there are two types. One is small amounts to ordinary people, and that was pawnbroking. When you go, somebody gives you a book he has and as a security, and you give him a certain amount. He brings back the money, you give him back his article. And if he doesn't bring his the money, the article is yours. And that's how many Jews in Christian Europe became pawnbrokers. But the other serious system of credit was that where you have a notarial act. You go to the notary and you write a document. I, so-and-so, declare that I have borrowed that amount of money from the Jew so-and-so for such a duration of time, after which I will pay for this 100, say, solidi that I took, I will pay him 120 at the end of this 2 months or so. If the Christian borrower brings back the money, the document, by the way, it's called in Hebrew shtar, and in English, of course, the word is found in medieval English, star. It's the same. Now, you bring the document and then you cut it. If it is torn, if it is cut with scissors, with a knife, it means that it's paid. That's it. If you have the document and it's not paid, and there is, of course, a copy in the notary, you go to the court and claim the money. That is why sometimes the Jews were attacked, their houses burned, etc., because they wanted to eliminate the evidence. That's right. So you go to the Christian court if need be. Yes, sir.
How do we refute the lies about the Jewish merchants engaging, I don't know, at that time, enslaved?
Well, I think, first of all, you don't have to refute the fact, I mean, a Jew does not have to apologize for the various financial activities of other Jews. First, because you're not responsible for any Jew. Second, not only is there no reason that you should apologize, the Jews' activities in the financial life of various countries in Europe was vital, without which life could not have carried on. Therefore, that's one thing you have to remember. Then, I think I have given today enough arguments and explanations to show that the Jews were in no position to impose on Europe any condition. They were the ones who were used and abused. And when they were used and they thought that they no longer needed them, they threw them out. One has to analyze, as I did today with you, the background of the Jewish settlements, why they were allowed to come. I showed you the condotta that the Christian rulers wanted them to give credit because it was a necessary act. It was a necessary activity. And therefore, if Shakespeare writes something in his plays without having ever seen a Jew around, because there were no Jews in England, it is because of an anti-Semitic trend that was everywhere. It is, as I said, it is very convenient to allow the Jews to do the dirty work, blame them for it, and say, the king would never admit what I said today, that he needed the Jews because he wanted the money from the Christians via the Jews to come to him. And what do I care that the Jews are blamed? The same happened in Poland. The kings of Poland and the aristocracy sent the Jews to collect the taxes. And who was hated? The Jew. Because the Christian saw the Jew, he didn't see the aristocrat. So the refutation should be based first on historical evidence. And the refutation of such claims by Zombard must be, I think, heard, must be written, and if somebody who is engaged with you in an argument, he is with an open mind and he will see. If he's an anti-Semite, nothing will help, so don't waste your energy. Okay? All right, thank you very much.